what the monitor shows. In Claire's kitchen, the lists always waited like a set of instructions to a machine. Bottle times in neat loops, emergency numbers lined up where the corkboard met a dangling string of keys, a password for the internet written large on a sticky note by the phone. She left them even on quick nights, even when she and Mark were only going across town to a birthday thing or to fetch milk. Edie always said she didn't mind. There was comfort in being told what to do, in holding a small part of someone as sword her, and keeping it steady while the world moved around it. The baby had already gone down before they left. The little handheld monitor on the coffee table whispered a steady wash of ocean sound as if the house were built on a dune. The screen showed a smeary image that the handbook in the drawer would have probably called sufficient, a crib rectangle, a shape under a blanket, a slow lift and fall that marked breathing. The picture was always a little flat, a little grainy, as though she were looking through the skin of a pond. Things had the wrong edges on that screen. The nightlight made a pale halo at one side, shadows bent wrong at the corners. But you got used to it. You told yourself it was fine enough. She had a routine on these nights. Shoes off by the mat, mug out, kettle on the coil until the little click from the thermostat inside said it was alive. Claire's lamp in the living room warmed the room to a quiet gold. The heater coughed and then brought up a steady hum. She sat with the monitor and let the little machine tell her that a baby slept, that the ocean kept ebbing along behind everything in small plastic waves. It took her a minute to realize the warning had been there from the start. The little grey bar on top said no signal. Old house, new electronics. Sometimes the picture cut out and came back. Edie tapped the side with a knuckle, the way you did with anything misbehaving. The warning held steady. The picture did not go away. If anything, it sharpened, lines firming up as if someone had cleaned the lens in another room while she watched. She frowned and leaned in. The crib looked wrong. It had a scalloped headboard like something old, hand-carved, the sort of thing that came with stories about who made it and who slept in it first. The wallpaper wore moons in a repeating sprinkle, pale discs with a hush to them, as if they would give off light if you were unwise enough to turn off the lamp. A mobile drifted above the crib that was not the bright whales. It looked like some delicate dark thing, not quite insect, not quite seed pods, as though moths had learned choreography and were practicing over the tiny chest below. Edie glanced around the room to check if somehow the living room had quietly altered while her head was bent. Everything read as it should, the soft dent in the sofa cushion where she had sat last time, the dented lampshade that Claire swore she would replace and never did. Mark's paperbacks in a crooked stack under the window. She looked back down. The bar kept its calm message, no signal. Behind it, the wrong nursery was steady as a photograph. She tapped the monitor again. She pressed the little recessed button with a fingernail. The warning stayed pinned. The picture stayed wrong. She kept breathing evenly for the baby's sake, out of habit. Her own breath fogged the edge of the screen for a heartbeat. The fog thinned. The scallops at the headboard shone softly as if wiped. She didn't trust what a machine told her when it was also telling her it told her nothing. She set the monitor down and went to check. In the hall, the house had the kind of quiet that turns your attention to your own body, to the sound of your step and the shift of your coat. She passed the little framed print of a harbor that had belonged to someone's aunt and then belonged to someone's yard sale. The nursery door sat half closed, the way Claire liked it. Inside smelled faintly of baby soap and clean cotton, and the new paint Mark had rolled over one weekend. The whales on the wallpaper were frosted little smiles. The crib was plain white slats. The mobile was bright and silly, little plastic shapes that knocked each other with a soft click whenever the fan stirred the air. The baby slept in a slow cadence, a small tide under a blanket stitched with boats. Edie stood and watched. She kept her hands away from the rails, out of something like superstition. as if touching would wake the tiny sleeper by some invisible string. The ocean sounds from the monitor downstairs had a seam where the loop met itself. She listened for it. There it was, a soft blip, and then the wash began again from the top. A soft tick came from the wall, fine and dry, like a moth brushing a lampshade. She turned toward the door, catching herself in the dresser mirror as a dark shape with a pale face. Not a surprise. Reflex had her glance down at the other monitor on the dresser, the one that talked to the handheld. Its tiny screen showed the crib, with the soft blur of motion on the baby's chest, the corner of the room, the door. It also showed Edie, hand on the rail, face tipped toward the door as if listening. She went still. Her hand had not moved. She was not touching the rail. But the image convinced otherwise, making a neat lie out of light on a screen. The message "no signal" held above the picture, as if some calm official statement would keep the rest of it from being real. She watched the wrong room seep into the right one even here. The whales faded toward moonlight. The mobile's bright pieces darkened as if wet. The headboard grew a scalloped edge, like a smile held too long. The monitor on the dresser was no longer a toy that sent reassurance down a hallway. It was a small stage where some version of the room arranged itself for a play. Edie turned the unit off. The picture blinked to black, the ocean cut off like a cough swallowed mid-breath. Silence moved in. The baby slept on, cheeks round and still. From downstairs came the humble life of a house. The fridge thrumming, a baseboard tick, air rattling in a vent. She told herself the word she needed to hold: glitch, a cheap thing doing what cheap things do. In the morning there would be coffee and likely a laugh, and the story would already sound smaller. She turned the dresser monitor back on, because sometimes saying glitch out loud and seeing the same trick again let the worry pass through you and leave you untouched. The warning blinked up, steady and grey. The wrong scalloped crib returned. The moth-like shapes kept their soft little bumping music. On the coffee table downstairs, the handheld gave a dutiful click like a radio waking up. Something else clicked too. An old sound she knew from every house she had ever lived in, the slight, careful turn of a front doorknob by someone who did not want to wake anyone. She did not breathe. The door did not open. There was only the sense of a hand on the other side. The monitors kept up their work. The wrong room sharpened itself line by line. There was a rocker in the corner now, the same one they had once owned before Claire told Edie to take it. And Edie kept it for a while, and then left it on the curb because it took up too much space and sat like another person in whatever room it went to. The dented lampshade from the living room stood quite confidently on the dresser in that wrong picture, as if it belonged better there than here. Once you saw that, you could not unsee the pattern. It was as if the house had drawn a card from the past and laid it over itself. Edie's fingers found the power button again. The handheld downstairs clicked, and the porch boards gave a faint, soft moan, the way wood does when weight shifts outside. She kept her breath light. She forced her shoulders down. She told herself she would feel silly later. She went back down because it puts something right in you to check the thing you say is fine. The chain lay across the little bracket. The deadbolt stared with its nickel eye. The lock had not changed. She pressed her ear to the wood and felt the cold of night seeping through, that clean metallic cold that does not belong to a living room. She heard nothing but wind in the sparse trees along the edge of the yard, and the high, thin hiss of distance that might be a highway and might be the world itself moving. Back on the couch, she watched the baby's slow blanket breathing. She gave up on tea. She did not turn on the television because she did not want another screen telling another version of truth. Her eyes settled into that way of watching a sleeping infant where nothing happens and everything matters, and you find yourself holding your breath until the blanket lifts again. The room changed the way rooms change if you keep still long enough. Shadows smudged, a light somewhere on the street shifted, the heater clicked. In the monitor, the light did the same, and yet wrong. The whales faded a little more than a shadow would account for. At the edges of the walls, little moons were not quite there, and then were there. The mobile's bright pieces took on a dull cast, as if soot had kissed them. Edie stood before she had decided to stand. She woke the upstairs unit again and set it on the dresser so both screens showed the same wrong room. In both frames, her body stood with one hand on the rail. It looked like patience, it read a little like prayer. The real Edie stayed near the rug with her back to the wall, trying to pull distance open between herself and what the screens insisted on. The baby made a sound like a small lift and release of breath. Not a cry, not even a pre-cry. Edie's shoulder muscles bunched without her command. The wrong Edie on two screens leaned over the crib and let one hand hover over the blanket. The real one did not move at all. Time inched by the way a puddle runs along the mortar of a brick path. The little ocean track in the handheld reached its seam and started again. The soft tick against the wall kept time like a tiny metronome that no one had wound. When the doorknob turned again, there was no doubt in it. The latch whispered. Cold walked into the foyer in a thin stripe. The door opened a crack and no one stood there. Edie's eyes smarted at the sharp air. She did not step toward it. In both screens, the wrong Edie turned her face to the angle of the door, as if listening for an instruction delivered under breath. The wrong Edie moved toward that emptiness at a pace that would not wake a sleeping thing. She held a steady line, like someone carrying water in an old pitcher. She reached the open door, paused there to read the air, and then stepped out. Both monitors blinked to black, like someone had rubbed out chalk. The baby began to cry. The sound arrowed through Edie hard enough to push tears to the edge of her eyes. She moved fast and wrong and bumped her shoulder on the door jamb. The baby's cry went high and raw, with that rasp in it that sounded too much like grief for such a brand new mouth. Edie scooped the small heat from the crib and felt the sweat at the back of the tiny neck, the hot damp of exertion along the hairline. She rocked like she had practiced, and the baby bucked as if fighting even comfort. She carried the little body to the window to give it something to look at, besides the mess of a face above it. Outside, the porch bulb gave the yard a tired yellow that stopped at the line of trees. Nothing moved. A car somewhere made a long, slow passing noise and went on pretending distance belonged to someone else. The baby's crying hinged and dropped off. She went still. Edie glanced down in a hurry and met eyes too wide for that soft face. The baby was not looking at Edie. She was looking over Edie's shoulder with a focus like the focus of a cat who has seen a moth. Edie turned because you cannot not turn when that happens. The monitors were awake. Where there had been blackness sat a room that looked exactly as it should. Crib, whales, silly mobile. The throw folded neatly across the rocker, essay seat, because Claire liked to make things look like a picture whenever she could. The crib was empty. The sheet had a little rumple, as if something had just been lifted from it. The monitor did not say anything about it. It simply showed the fact. Edie put her cheek to the baby's hair and inhaled the smell of warmed cotton. The baby's gaze did not move from the shining little screen. Her mouth worked, as if a word had gotten into it through a window and was trying hard to get out. Edie felt cold along her spine, as if air had found a seam in her coat. The handheld gave a click that sounded like a hand settling on a table. The picture shifted, not in a way you see on television when a video jitter skips, but more like a person in the room had stood up and moved the camera a small, polite amount. The wrong nursery returned, moons pale on the walls like quiet moons. The wrong Edie stood by the empty crib with her hands empty as fists. The wrong Edie lifted her head and looked into the camera like a person who had been told where to find it. The baby in Edie's arms made a sound like water catching on a stone. Her mouth opened and worked. The wrong Edie reached toward the rail and stopped and did not know what to do with her hands. The real baby exhaled a long breath, and let her body go loose as laundry. Edie did not think anything with grammar. She held the little body the way you hold something important when the shelf under your hands is not to be trusted. She pressed her lips to a hot forehead and tried not to feel for the breath she could not see. The monitors, being machines, had no problem with seeing anything at all. They showed the wrong Edie folding the small blanket with care and smoothing it flat with the flat of a palm, and then leaving the wrong room again. They showed movement down the hall as if there were cameras queued up, as if some other pair of hands had decided there would be a record of this and had arranged it. The house downstairs let in more cold. The front door sounded tired on its hinges. No steps crossed the threshold. No shape moved in the doorway. The monitors fell dark as if the idea of showing ran out. In Edie's arms, the baby drew in a breath and found it. The tightness in the chest let go the way a knot lets go after you work at it with a thumbnail until the rope softens. The baby's eyes were still on some point beyond Edie. It felt to Edie like the child aimed her at something the way a flashlight gets aimed. The lips moved again, and a word came that was not a word so much as an intent. Wait. The front door downstairs eased itself closed with a click that could have been the house practicing manners. The baby settled heavy in Edie's arms. The monitors kept their darkness. Edie tucked the baby down like she was laying a loaf into a basket. The hands that had held tools and groceries and damp laundry felt foolishly unsteady while they folded the corner of a blanket the way Claire liked it done. The baby resumed the slow tide of breathing. The nightlight softened the edges. The wails were only wails. Her own heart argued with her ribs. In the kitchen, the lists waited as if this were any night. Bottle time, numbers to call, a password for the thing that connected them to everything else. Edie dialed because doing something with her hands would keep her from listening too hard to the quiet. Claire answered with the hush people use when they are somewhere loud and do not want to sound like they forgot the baby when they went out. Edie told her everything was fine because what else could she do with her mouth? The words made a neat bridge, and Claire walked across them and said good, and said the familiar things people say so they can go back to their dinner, and hung up with a kind small promise to be home soon. Edie sat at the table after that and pressed her fingertips to the place where the wood had a shallow dip from years of wrists and plates. She felt like a pan recently off the stove, heat without purpose. In the living room, the handheld held an ordinary picture for a while. A kind picture, a picture that said, "You are good at this, you have kept the order, nothing has slipped through any crack." Edie breathed and took that gift. The fridge hummed, the heater kicked. When the heater stopped, silence widened in the room like a slow-held breath. Edie stood because in that quiet, nothing else seemed possible. Upstairs, she study-turned on the dresser unit and watched it agree with the handheld. All was well. She moved to the doorway and watched the baby sleep the way babies sleep, when the muscles of their face have not yet learned all the possible expressions. She should have gone back downstairs then. She did not. The picture did not require it, but something underneath the picture asked her to stay. She leaned in the jam and felt paint under her fingernail, where the wood had a small ridge. The dresser monitor showed her step in. It showed her fingers find the rail. The real Edie did not cross the threshold. She felt an old feeling from childhood, when she had learned to stand still in a hallway and listen because someone had said, "Wait," and they had a good reason to say it, and also you did not want to find out what happened if you did not. The baby opened her eyes and found the screen. Edie did not like that. The look on the small face had too much purpose in it. The monitor showed the wrong. Edie lay a hand lightly, where the blanket lifted and fell, and then lifted away, and then turn as if to leave again. The real Edie did not move. She imagined the floor joists all the way down to the crawl space, and every nail that held them, and the old spiders and the new ones, and something about the thought steadied her. The front door sounded again with its little low moan. She did not dare to think about anyone, being a person, opening it. She could not carry that. The wrong Edie on the screen drifted down the stairs with that same water-carrying care. The camera followed as though this were a show, though Edie could not allow it to be a show, though every pulled stitch in the world told her to look away. The picture went black again, the baby's eyes shut. She made a soft little sound that if you pressed your own ear to your own shoulder, you might hear when you are about to sleep and your body throws one last small stone into the pool of the day. The front door clicked shut. Edie turned the dresser unit off and the room became only a room. She spent the next stretch of time doing house things to prove the house could be made to behave. Locks checked, windows latched, 2 lights turned off and then on again, for no reason other than to see if they would obey. The doormat adjusted by a small amount because it lay crooked and because she did not want to stand there thinking about why the doormat lay crooked. The handheld waited on the coffee table when she returned, dark as a face with the eyes closed. She left it like that because turning it on felt like inviting a story to begin again. Headlights slid past the front window, enough later that Edie had time to think about that word later and decide she could not place it. The car doors gave their bright outdoor clack. Voices came in a bundle. The front door opened the right way with a rush of real cold. Claire brought the smell of rain in with her and shook off her shoulders like a bird. She looked at Edie, and something in Edie's face told her which voice to use. "What's wrong?" she asked. Edie could not make her voice into anything useful. Mark came in with his easy posture and lost it when he saw how Edie was sitting. He asked the question parents ask with his chin up, like a man ready to go outside after a dog. "Is the baby okay?" Edie nodded because for that moment the baby was sleeping upstairs with a neat little breath. Claire moved past and went up. Edie listened to her steps with an attention so sharp it hurt. There is a tone wood makes when eyes are on it. The nursery door opened. The pause that followed filled the whole house from roof to crawl space. Claire came down with her hands at her sides, like someone learning to hold them. She said she is gone. Edie sat and did not move and understood that words could change what you knew without changing what you saw. Mark made the highest sound he had ever made. Claire's mouth worked through the shape of the statement again and did not make it better. Edie lifted the handheld and turned it on because sometimes you hold a coal a second time to be sure it still burns. The message flashed no signal with a politeness that made Edie want to throw it, and then the right nursery appeared as empty as a glass on a table. The monitor showed nothing but still air and the empty crib and the mobile going its small spiral to no purpose, and the door jamb. In that frame, Edie stood by the crib with her hand on the rail and her face angled to listen. The real Edie sat on the couch with the cold seeping into her bones. The picture made one ask of her that it had been making all night. It had the patient weight of expectation, the way some houses have the smell of the sea even when they are inland. She felt that weight settle. She could feel in her fingers the shape of a rail that was not there. It would be easy to write herself into the wrong room and let the picture know what to do with her. It occurred to her that there was no good place to put her hands and no good room to stand in. She set the monitor down because just then she could not bear the way its small screen wanted her attention. The heater turned on and the sound soothed nothing. In the kitchen, one of Claire's lists made a faint sliding sound against the counter. Paper to wood. The lamp hum deepened for a heartbeat and then evened out. The hall held a chill that felt as if it would be permanent. Claire sat across from Edie but in another world and looked at her as if Edie held the line to the only person she needed to reach. Mark said her name once and Edie heard her name and did not know if it belonged. It was as if the house had decided to become a radio that pulled in a station from far away, where the same family sat at the same table missing the same child. In that odd, stretched quiet, something else spoke in a bright, borrowed voice from the tiny speaker at the side of the handheld, where the ocean used to come from. It was tinny and plainly recorded somewhere else on some other day. It said the sort of cheerful nothing people say at the end of anything. Thanks for watching. Hit the button, stay tuned. The words were full of a kind of empty care. They rolled through the living room and broke into the kind of silence that has weight. No one in the room laughed at it. The little sound ended and left a gap the exact size of itself. Edie closed a palm over the monitor the way you do when rain comes on too hard and you want to protect a match. She did not ask how the words had gotten into the machine or what they had to do with a child in a quiet room. She did not say anything at all. Claire folded her hands on the table with care and laid her forehead on top of them for a second and then took it back up because she could not allow herself that much permission. Mark went to the base of the stairs and held still there, as if the house would go on if he made his body into a nail. The night sat down with them and stayed. The heater quit. In the nursery, the wails were patient and then were not anything at all, because Edie did not turn the monitor back on to ask them what they were doing. Time did whatever it does when the only clock that matters is a chest rising and falling in a crib that is not on any screen. In the dark, the house thought long thoughts in wood and wind and showed them nothing. Edie's mind kept trying to push the story toward the place where calls were made to authorities. It hit a soft wall there. She did not trust her throat with numbers, and she did not trust any official voice to find the room on a screen that kept insisting she was already in it. She could not step into a world where there were going to be lights on the lawn and questions with forms and a clipboard. Not yet. She watched the gap between a list and a counter, watched a drip of condensation creep on the glass of the window and catch the skim of streetlight. She listened for the ocean at the seam and heard only the slow work of a house holding itself upright. Claire stood and went upstairs again because sitting is a thing a body can only do for so long when it has given birth to something that is not in its arms. Edie stood too because she could not let Claire be the only person in motion. Mark followed as if stairs were a ladder down into a hole and he had been told there was a child somewhere at the bottom. At the nursery door, Claire's hand hovered and then pushed and then found nothing new. They entered like trespassers do when they pretend to authority. The nightlight showed them a room that had no child in it and had never had any child in it if you asked the evidence. Sheet smooth, blanket folded the way a careful hand had folded it, mobile idly turning. The dresser glossy under the dented lamp. Edie's reflection in the dark window looked like a woman caught between two doorway frames. The whales were only small painted animals on a paper that would curl at the edges in summer. Edie crossed and set her palm where the rail cut across the space her stomach made. The wood was warm from a small body only because bodies keep warmth, and wood keeps it for a little bit after. She tried to imagine what it would be like to feel nothing but cool paint. She could not. Mark said her name again. Claire removed the blanket from the crib and smoothed it on her own lap, and smoothed it again and placed it with great care at the foot of the crib. Little practical motions like that can argue back the huge, pointless ones. None of it changed anything. Edie knew that if she spoke, the words would slide around on the floor like socks. Downstairs, air moved where a door had been and settled again into the little drafts a house always keeps in its pockets. Outside, a far dog barked once and then thought better of it. The town slept like a person who did not know it had a reason to wake up. Somewhere, a fridge in another house made the same old sound as this one, and a person in another house put a cup back on a shelf, and the world kept happening whether or not you could bear it. They did not call anyone that night. There was a smell of rain when the furnace breathed, as if damp had crept into the ductwork and found a corner. The lists held their places on the counter. The sticky note with the long word for the internet curled up a little, at one corner like a leaf. Claire seated herself on the floor by the nursery door with her back to it and arranged her knees as if to be comfortable, and then did not move at all. Mark stood at the window and sought the rhythm of the mobile with his eyes and lost it. Edie took the dresser unit in both hands and carried it carefully to the floor. She pressed the tiny button that woke the screen, and the screen did the only thing it knew how to do. The grey bar spoke its grave little notice. The picture came up. The wrong room, with its scalloped edge and its moons, arranged itself with patience. The wrong Edie stood where she would have stood if she had gone to stand there. She held herself the way you hold yourself when you are waiting for instruction. The screen made a promise with its light. It did not matter that the promise was false. It mattered that it was, in the moment, more persuasive than the air. Edie sat on the floor before it, like a person before a fireplace, and let her shoulders fall forward and backed up into the cold piece of the dresser. Her own face in the corner of the screen, tiny and off to the side, did not look like hers and never would again. The sound inside the monitor's casing changed for a second, like plastic settling. The screen's light wavered, a small pulse like a breath held and released. The wrong Edie moved, not toward the door this time, not toward the empty crib. She stepped closer to the lens and dipped her head, as if to see who sat in the dark in front of her. It was not a step, really. It was a closing of the small, polite distance a person keeps when they do not know you well. Edie did not lean back. She refused to make room for whatever it was, to pull the air in deeper. She set the monitor aside and put both hands on the floor and held the old wood like a thing that could keep her if she held it right. The house breathed with her and without her, and had done so long before she learned to close a door without making a sound. Screens went on showing what they wanted to show. The ocean did not come back. That was as close as the night came to finishing itself. After that, there was only the long going on of it, the way a road goes on after the last house. You walk it. You keep walking, because what else are you going to do? The baby slept or did not sleep in a picture that would not be called a picture if you had any choice in the naming of it. The front door held with its small hinge size. The little moon wallpaper watched with its patient light where no one had stuck it. When the first thin hint of morning worked its way under the blinds, no one was different, and everyone was. Edie's eyes hurt in a way that argued with light. Claire stood without using her hands and went back upstairs to the room that had not restored itself. Mark followed a breath later. Edie sat in the living room where a person sits when winter comes. On the table, the hand held lay with its mouth closed. She kept her own hands flat. She had to. If she gave them anything to hold, they would hold it too hard. In the kitchen, the lists looked like a joke 2 days old. The little word for internet was an animal with a broken back. The phone was just a phone. Edie's mind kept trying to arrange a verse of language that would call anyone and make them come. The words came, but would not stick to each other. She heard in her head the bright recorded voice again, and it hated her. It would not be unwound. It would come back every time she walked past a quiet door, and would not mind in the least that the door was in a house where a child was meant to wake. The house allowed the morning. The refrigerator's hum sounded clearer in the good light. Dust on the television made a fine skin. Edie stood at last because bodies demand to be moved, or else they begin to ring at a pitch only you can hear. She walked to the front door and laid her palm flat against it and left it there until the cold came through her skin and turned her hand into something she did not have to feel anymore. When the young day brightened enough to count as day, she opened the door to look out at what the world thought it was, and the hinge complained like any hinge. The porch boards were just wood. The yard was a yard that had been mown and would need mowing again. The street had the long shadow of a trash can in it. There were no unusual tracks in the thin damp. She had understood already there would not be. You could tell a story of footprints and be made a fool by the dumb earth denying you. Later, she would stand and speak. She would choose numbers and tap them in. She would open the door to people who wore heavy belts and carried radios that spat flat words at them, and she would open the door to a neighbor with a wrapped plate of rolls because doing something with your hands helps. For now, she let the quiet of the house collect around her ankles like the wash of a tide that has never seen a sea. She would not ruin this quiet with reports. Not yet. She might sound different if she waited. She might by then be someone who could say what had happened without breaking the part of herself that believed in the way cupboards close and walls hold up. If the monitor on the coffee table had a thought, it kept it to itself. The screen did not brighten or ask to be touched. Edie turned away from it and took a step, and then another, and found that her body would carry her down the hallway the way it always had. Outside, someone, somewhere, turned over a car. The sound of it made a thin line on the morning. The heater came on. The day began its work. When you have been told by a small mouth to wait, even if the mouth makes no sound, even if the word comes through plastic and the backs of your eyes, you wait. It is less an instruction than a condition. It sets into you like a weather change. Edie felt it under her tongue. She felt it harden along her spine. It would not be undone by sunlight or anyone's favorite breakfast. It would sit and sit until it grew its own shape and cast its own thin shade in all the rooms she entered in the years that followed. And downstairs, where the empty air made its easy home inside a quiet crib shown by a small machine, a figure stood very still, hand on the rail, face turned toward the door, waiting. Morning thinned itself through the blinds until the house admitted it. A day can begin without anyone's consent. The heater found its rhythm, stopped, and found it again. Someone in the neighborhood dragged a bin to a curb and left it there. Edie sat on the couch and watched dust turn in the light as if it were a school of tiny fish deciding to go somewhere else. The handheld lay black and square where she had left it. The other monitor upstairs waited where she had set it on the floor. Blank glass eye turned to the room where a child did not breathe. By the time Claire dialed, Edie had already rehearsed going through the motions, the call, the questions, the visit, the polite and impolite looks at her face. She stood in the kitchen while Claire spoke and gave the words the room they needed. She ran a finger under the edge of a note and then left it. She looked at the magnet holding a pizza coupon to the fridge and thought about all the things people do with their hands to keep from saying the one thing they want to say. It turned out the questions were plain and meant well, heavy with procedures. Someone on a line in a room full of other lines asked for times as if times had been simple and clean. Someone said, "When did you last check the child?" And Claire said it, and then said it again with different words and kept her voice from breaking by pinching the bridge of her nose until the pain made a clean rail for her to walk on. In the small breaks between questions, the house offered its usual sounds like a consolation that had not learned it could be otherwise. Men and women came with solemn faces and belts full of tools. They softened their steps at the nursery door the way people do near any bed. They wrote things down in neat strokes and frowned when the pen didn't take and scribbled on their own palms and then wrote again. They asked Edie to tell what she had seen and heard. She told the plainest version because the other version lived in a device she did not trust and would not hand over until someone asked for it in a way that made sense. She did not want to say the words "wrong room" out loud in front of strangers because she already knew how that would look on their forms. They did ask for the monitors when their patience with the house finally got to the point where it needed batteries and model names. They lifted the handheld like a thing young and then old and then young again. They took the dresser unit in its power cord, wrapping it neatly with their practiced palm. They nodded and said the kind of words people say when they mean "we will let you know." Their radios made small insect sounds at their hips, sentences shaved down to stubs. Neighbors found reasons to walk past the front step. Their faces caught when they saw the mark on the doorframe where someone had set a shoulder too hard in some other season. They had brought casseroles in their minds and came away unsure what to do with their elbows. The yard wore footprints that did not seem to belong to any outcome and gave them very little to talk about. A thin line of grit along the porch boards glowed in the slant light like a line on a map that no one could read. Claire spoke with a steadiness that came from a place under her ribs that had nothing to do with order or lists. She said the baby's name as if the sound alone could call a response from air. Mark stood in a corner with a phone against his head while someone on the other end of the call told him what to think. He made very small sounds for a long time and then took the phone down and let his arm hang. His hand stayed pinched around the shape of the device after it was gone. The day's light climbed to noonish weight and then subsided toward the side of the windows that would hold it for a little while longer. The house leaned with it. Feet made paths in rooms that had once been too small for all the life in them and now felt like endless corridors. Edie moved from chair to wall to sink, as if there were a string from each place to her chest, and the string kept tugging in different directions, and she had made an agreement with herself to obey whatever tugged most. Late afternoon can be a kind place. It lays a hand on your shoulder and says you have gotten through most of this. Now, make soup. But the light in the living room turned a patient flat instead, a light that asked you to admit what was true and left you no space for a lie. Edie stood with the dish towel in her hand and could not remember how to fold it. She set it across the back of a chair and it slid off and lay on the floor like a small body that wanted to be picked up. She left it where it lay. You find out, in a day like that, what kind of people live in the town you live in. An officer with a pageboy haircut and eyes too tired for her face knocked softly and stepped in as if she had lived here all her life. She asked the questions again, gently, like a person asking the weather to be kind. When Edie said she believed there had been a mistake in what the monitors showed, the officer tilted her head to make room for that idea, as if turning would open a door in the air for it. She did not argue science at Edie. She took the thought down with the rest, even though her pen hesitated a fraction at the word glitch. She had children, maybe. Or else she had once stood in a room and watched time become a different animal in the space it takes for a person to blink. Another officer, a man with a sunburned neck, lifted the latch on the front door and shut it and opened it and shut it again, as if the door might confess something if he repeated himself gently enough. He ran a hand along the edge of the jamb like a person feeling for splinters. He crouched to the plug where the monitor had been and frowned as if electricity itself were something he could coax into telling its story. He said words about signals and interference without committing to belief in them. Procedure had requirements, belief was not one of them. They asked Edie to walk them through the night again later, with the lamps on for a different tone, as if light could help you remember. She told it step by step as though she were careful not to step on seams in the sidewalk, and this time the recorded voice came into it because she could not leave it out forever. The cheerful patter that had seeped through a speaker in a room where anything but cheer belonged. Edie did not try to account for that. She let it sit there and make its shape and make them look at it. The pageboy officer wrote it down without a blink. The man with the sunburned neck touched the small of his back the way people do when it aches and asked a question about internet things with apology in his eyes. No one in the room knew the answer, and that was a form of mercy. By evening, old light nosed into the house and went to ground in the corners. The refrigerator's hum took on that nighttime quality where it seems louder for the space around it. The baseboards ticked with a regularity that might have been comfort if you let it be. Someone had brought food and left it on the kitchen counter with a small note because people needed to feel useful with their feet. The casserole went unheated. The note sat under the corner of a cutting board like something that would take a little damage for the household. Neighbors did what neighbors do. A woman from across the street came and caught Claire's hands and said a sentence that had no practical value, but held its own weight like a good bolt. She meant it. She held Claire's eyes until Claire looked away and the connection broke. Someone called from the sidewalk to Mark in a voice shaped like a question mark, and Mark answered with a thumb lifted to say he had heard and would call if he needed anything. And then he put the thumb down and went inside and shut the door behind him and leaned his whole weight into it, and then stopped leaning because he did not want to injure the little screws that held the hinges to the frame. Edie moved herself up the stairs to the nursery because she could not stop her body from going where it had learned to go. She stopped in the doorway and did not enter because parts of the floor in there were now attached to events that she could not bear to set off like trapwires. The air in the room had a faint talc to it, even though the powder had been put away weeks ago after a Dr.'s advice about lungs. The paint smell had given itself over to the ordinary breath of a room in winter. She could see where Mark had missed a thin line behind the radiator and had later gone back with a brush on a stick. The line had a different gloss to it and caught the nightlight differently. She held the jam the way she had learned to hold herself and watched absences. The baby's blanket folded as it had been laid, the slight compression along the mattress where a small weight had made a dip for a while, the tilted angle of the dented lampshade seam, which had been tilted for so long that it seemed defiant to set it straight. She closed the door a third of the way Claire preferred it, careful with the latch so it wouldn't click and wake no one. Downstairs, the television sat with its face turned to the room, like a person who had been told not to look and was doing a poor job of it. Each remote on the table waited with symbolic patience. Edie turned away from the screen and glanced toward the kitchen instead. She heard Claire pick up a spoon and set it down without stirring anything. She heard Mark open and close a cupboard door, just to be opening and closing something that did not have an opinion about it. In the middle of the night that wasn't night anymore because none of them had slept, a soft storm began. More rain than wind and more steady than sudden. The house gathered its sounds around it, the roof taking the patter like a drum skin, the gutters trying to make the water a song and failing. The air vent clicked its tiny metal contraction needle over and over. Edie lay on the couch with her forearm over her eyes and counted nothing. Her mind watched the dark for mistakes in the edges of things. At some hour that would have had a number if she believed in numbers, the power thinned and came back, a small dip that unseated nothing and then reseated it. The refrigerator stuttered and resumed its song. The lamp swam a little. The handheld woke itself, brightening from its own darkness without being touched, as if the breaker box in the basement had turned in its sleep and bumped a switch. The screen came up with the calm bar that said nothing, in a way that implied it was saying something. It offered the wrong room with its moons, gentle and pale, as if the paint in that room had been mixed with a pinch of ash. There was no one in the picture. The wrong crib stood empty and steady, a piece of furniture that would not confess anything under a hard light. The camera angle had shifted a little, as though someone had straightened it while talking about something ordinary. Edie's body did a small thing without consulting her mind. She reached for the monitor and brought it closer, and then placed it in her lap like a creature that might move. Her breath slowed because of the world on the screen, even though nothing had earned that slowing. Sometimes light itself convinces you. The muffled rain carried on. Upstairs, boards sounded a human weight and went quiet. She told herself she was not going to learn anything from staring at a device. She kept staring because learning was not the only thing staring could be for. Sometimes it was simply a place to put your want where it could not damage anyone. The room on the screen softened and sharpened in long breaths because that is how little cameras see. After a long stretch of nothing inside the picture, A hand entered the frame at the door jamb, a familiar hand, the veins like fine rivers, the second knuckle carrying the small notch from where she had slammed it in a truck door one summer. The hand took the jamb, and the wrong Edie followed it into the frame with the rest of herself. She did not look at the camera. She did not look at the crib. She stood and listened the way the picture had taught her. She held herself where a person would stand if they were waiting for someone to pass in a hallway. Nothing passed. The storm hushed itself by degrees until the house had only its own noises again. Claire's whisper drifted once from the stairs and then stopped. Mark's foot made a small complaint across a tread and stilled. The fridge thrummed, content in its own purpose. The handheld shone, putting a little light in the cup of Edie's palm. She became conscious of her own skin in a way she did not like. The way it did not quite fit where her shoulder met her chest. The way her face had settled into a shape she could not undo. She rose and put the monitor on the table and stepped to the foyer. The door had beads of rain along its bottom edge, the small dark marks that meant the weather had come under, as weather always finds a way. She touched the chain and left it where it was. She stood as if someone had said, "Wait," to her in a voice that did not use sound. At first light, that felt like bruised fruit rather than clean morning. The officers returned for another pass at the house. When a thing cannot be found, people come back to the place where it was last seen, as though sight were a spell that could be cast in more than one direction. They spoke to each other in low tones that kept work from spilling into the part of themselves that had to go home and sleep. The pageboy officer knelt by the baseboard in the nursery and stared at the little line of paint with her mouth open a little, thinking hard. The sunburned officer pinched the bridge of his nose until the pinching left a mark. They took photographs of ordinary angles and of corners, and of the small dent in the lampshade, and of the place the rocker would have sat if there had been one. They asked Claire and Mark for permission to look in places where no one expected to find a child. The permission was given because you do such things when your body understands that nothing you do will make the number of beds in a house add up to the number of persons it holds. Someone somewhere made a report about the weather because weather must be accounted for whenever anything happens. A neighbor murmured about cameras in doorways and whether anyone had them. Edie overheard words about routers and saved footage and whether the signal could be coaxed out of a cheap machine. The words felt ridiculous and necessary at the same time. They slid through the air like fish through grass. By the following morning, faces had begun to arrange themselves into the official expressions communities where, when something has gone wrong in a house with siding that needs paint, flyers began their small, quiet multiplication. An email with a banner went around, gentle and urgent, the kind that promises a town to itself if all its citizens will simply look at porches they were already looking at. At the store, voices dropped when Claire's name was spoken. A clerk set aside a carton of eggs by mistake and then left it out all afternoon because later he could no longer recall which eggs were which. The ordinary system that moves a town along caught on a burr and then kept moving with a hitch. Edie took her orders from the day. She walked the block with the pageboy officer because walking is what you do when staying still would make you harm yourself. They watched under eaves where nests had been built and pulled down. They glanced under porch stairs because that is the place everyone and everything goes when there's nowhere else to go. They avoided one another, eyes, and filled the space between their bodies with the sound of their sneakers on pavement. A dog with pale fur looked up from a yard and did not bark. The air had that metallic smell that comes after rain. Not blood, not iron, just the mineral truth of water and stone. When the walking had satisfied no one, Edie went back inside and did the work of wiping counters until they had no reason to be wiped. She stacked coasters. She straightened a pile of bills without opening them. She folded a dish towel and this time it stayed. She picked up the handheld and put it down and picked it up again and set it on the windowsill where a little draft would fall across it and make it seem less technological, colden it into an object rather than a device. In the kitchen, the lists remained on the corkboard because taking them down felt like doing harm to an order that had barely sustained them. Bottle times became a row of boats no one sailed. The emergency numbers were a line of black that Edie did not call because there are emergencies, and there is this. The password curled at one corner, the ink a little smeary where a damp thumb had pressed without meaning to. Edie wanted to press her own thumb on it and smear it beyond legibility. She left it alone. That night, the monitors came home in the hands of the sunburned officer, who spoke in a careful tone about tests and downloads and difficulty with proprietary file formats. He set them down and patted one absurdly like a pet. He said it might help to have the devices where they had been. He said there is a kind of memory a place has for the items it holds. He tried to hide apology behind practicality and nearly succeeded. Claire thanked him because she could not bear to not thank him. Mark nodded and kept his hand on the back of the chair the whole time, as if attaching himself to furniture would keep him from jumping out of his own skin. They plugged the dresser unit in with the sort of difficulty that tells you how the rest of your life will feel for a very long time. The plug went in, the cord ran along the baseboard. The small light on the back allowed itself to glow. The handheld was placed in its cradle on the table downstairs, like a body in a small boat. The grey bar appeared obediently, and then moved its message aside to make room for whatever was going to happen next. The wrong room came into focus, as if it had been waiting behind a door to be let out. The scalloped headboard gleamed in a way that never looked like paint. The moons on the wall gave off no light, and yet the corners of the room wore them like a tired scarf. The mobile hung, black and slight, officious in its soft movements, turning very little and with purpose. The rocker took its corner as if someone had pushed it into the carpet over a slow hour. The dented lamp claimed the dresser with a small proprietary tilt. It was a room that had used their rooms for parts. No figure stood in this frame at first. The picture looked like the after of a history book photo. Edie and Claire and Mark sat with their bodies arranged as though for a portrait of a family in a waiting room. The hush had the feel of a church hall after a potluck, the clean echo of scraped plates. When the wrong Edie entered the frame at last, she entered on the left and moved to the crib with a day worker's competence, as if assigned. She rested her hand on the rail. The real Edie looked down at her own empty hands and found nothing there, and then found everything there. She stood before she had decided to stand. Claire's head turned a fraction. Mark placed his palm flat on the table as if to keep it from tilting. Edie did not go upstairs. She went to the foot of the real stairs and stopped and listened. From upstairs came the good small sounds of the house counting itself. Wood exhaling, a pipe settling, the clockless measure of air. Nothing else. Even the rain had given up and gone to bed somewhere else. She turned back to the screen and found the wrong Edie looking toward the door as if someone had spoken in the hall. The camera seemed closer than before, or else she had leaned forward without knowing it. In the tiny, shining world, the wrong Edie had a patience the real one did not and would not. She looked like a person who could be counted on to stand in one spot for as long as it took. It occurred to Edie that if someone were to walk into that frame carrying anything at all, the wrong Edie would have 2 free hands. She slept a little on the couch after that. Not the good sleep, but the thin, hard kind that makes a film behind your eyes. A dream attempted to play a trick on her and make a baby out of a pile of pillowcases. The trick failed, and the pillowcases lay scattered where she had kicked them. She took a glass of water from the counter and drank half, and set it down, and watched a tiny track of condensation make a line on the wood like a patient caterpillar. The next day's sun was thin and mean. The town had done what towns do at the end of a story they cannot write the last line of. They went to work and spoke of weather. They adjusted their faces when they saw one another. The people who were kindest said nothing. The people who were less kind said the right things and meant them and felt better. The power company sent a message to phones about a scheduled maintenance and an apology for any inconvenience, and no one in their house read it. And a day later, the power would blink at an odd hour and then hold. Edie went down to the basement in mid-afternoon to stand in a different air. The concrete held cool damp, smelling of dirt and old paint. A line of dead gnats decorated a little window above the dryer drum, a quiet knotted garland that no one would remove until spring. The breaker box sat squat against the walls like a little locked book whose language she had never learned. She did not touch it. She touched instead the edge of the washer where the enamel had chipped and rust had made a small blooming flower. Touching iron steadied her the way saying your full name to yourself can sometimes keep you from stepping into the wrong lane. She climbed back up to a house the same as the one she had left and found it had changed entirely. Claire sat in the rocker that had returned from its wrong corner to a right corner in their minds. She sat without rocking and held a mug without drinking. In her posture was a portrait of a concept older than any house. Mark stood at the window and counted a set of things beyond the glass that did not exist. The hand held on the sill made a fine line of light along its edge, like a knife showing a little of itself. When evening came, the streetlights wore halos and then had to give them up to rain. The wind flapped the plastic chair on the porch and then left it be. A truck went by, in a cautious way, the kind of speed that says driver and machine have agreed to avoid harm rather than reach an address. Somewhere inches away in a wall, a spider made something elaborate that no one would admire. The house waited. Waiting had rearranged itself into something like furniture. You had to walk around it. You bumped your hip on it in the dark and said nothing. They did not keep the monitors on all the time. That would have been insane in the meek way ordinary insanity announces itself. They tried to use them like you use lights, on when necessary, off when possible. Most evenings one of them would check, only check, never admit the wanting under the checking, and the wrong room or the right room would answer with a picture of a waiting crib. The wrong Edie made regular appearances at no times any of them could map. Sometimes she stood, sometimes she had gone. No one mentioned that there was less of her than there had been, as if the glass and the light were wearing her down. Edie pretended not to feel lighter the way a person does when they've lost weight without wanting to and have to admit their bones have the right to be counted. On a night without rain, the air felt full of something like static. The porch light hummed a little. The kitchen bulb made a sound so high you could make yourself believe you had imagined it. Edie's teeth ached in the way old fillings predict the weather. She turned off the ceiling light and left the little lamp on because the smallness made the room kinder. She touched the handheld and knew the ridges of its plastic by heart now. The screen woke to a room that was not the wrong room or the right room, but something between. Whales struggling to keep their blue as moons gathered like frost in the corners. The mobile half-plastic, half-delicate black, a rocker that could be either the kind they had owned or its other self, depending on the glance. The crib held a smoothed blanket. Edie watched the picture take slow, deep breaths like a person asleep whose dreams have meaning to them. The front doorknob moved with the biological certainty of a heartbeat. Just a small turn, deliberate and gentle. It did not matter that the chain held. It did not matter that both sides of the door knew the rule. The knob turned as if a hand had matured on the other side of it, out of air and cold, and learned what doors were for and wanted to practice. Edie did not call for Mark. She did not call for Claire. She stood and stepped to the foyer and put her palm on the door and felt the weight of that testing hand on the other side. She did not let go, and the other hand did not either. And then both let go, because both knew stalemate better than triumph. She went upstairs, because both surrender and victory are not what ordinary lives are made of, and ordinary lives require you to climb stairs at least as often as you stand still. In the nursery, she did not cross to the crib. She stood in the doorway with her shoulder to the frame. The lamp gave the room a careful radius of amber. The blanket in the crib had a crease she had not ironed into it. The mobile's little plastic pieces made their slow knock like polite fingernails on a table. The dresser unit sat on the floor near the wall. She reached down to it and pressed the button the way one tests a bruise to learn the edges of it. The bar offered its assurance that there was nothing to see. The screen offered its assurance that there was something to see. The wrong room resolved again into itself with no struggle. The wrong crib, the wrong moons, the wrong lamp at its wrong elegant angle, and then the wrong Edie stepping into her position by the rail. It struck her that she had never seen the wrong Edie leave the room any way but toward the door. It struck her that she had never seen the wrong Edie sit down. It struck her that the wrong Edie looked in the last days a tiny bit like someone who had learned the rules too well and was tired of keeping them. That thought frightened her more than anything. She put the monitor down and kept her right hand on the door jamb and her left hand at her side, a compromise between standing and holding herself up. Something then shifted in the air the way the air does just before the furnace kicks on. A shallow swell, an intake that has nothing to do with lungs. The sound that followed was small and exact, like a child's finger running along the rim of a glass. "Wait," it said again, without saying anything. It touched her in that place the first word had burrowed. It did not ask. It laid down its law the way weather does. She had thought the first time that perhaps she pushed the word into the air with her own fear and shaped it into meaning. This time she knew it belonged to something outside her. Edie did what a person does when the air decides. She stepped forward until her palm found the rail. The crib was empty, and yet the wood felt more crowded than her hand could stand. She told herself she would lay her hand down just long enough to prove she could, to satisfy a small, mean itch, and then she would lift it. She told herself she would break the spell by standing where the wrong figure stood with such shameless patience. She waited. She counted her heartbeats without numbers, like counting pigeons from a train window. She breathed the way you breathe when a throat is dry. She looked neither at the empty crib nor at the dresser monitor. She fixed her eyes on the little nick in the paint by the far leg of the crib, where Mark S. Ring had clipped it one morning hard enough to make him swear softly. She let the room be that small. The house took one deep breath, the way a sleeper does when a dream turns. Downstairs, a glass settled with a mouse squeak you only hear on the second day of a new arrangement. The porch light flickered once, a polite hesitation. The heater came on and then went off as if changing its mind. In the hall, Claire's step moved and then did not. On the table, the handheld display brightened of its own accord. In the handheld square, the camera leaned closer in the tender lying way it has, and room and crib and rail and the figure at the rail made their little theater. The wrong Edie was not wrong. Not now. It was Edie, and the rail under her hand was a rail, and the moons cast no light, and the whales elsewhere had gone wherever failed paint lives. In the little screen there was a shape in the crib, not a child shape, not yet. Something like the idea of weight settling back into a bed after a long shift away. It could have been a trick of light, that idea. It could have been the ghost of how a blanket creases. Edie did not look down in the real room to check, because sometimes checking kills the part you most need to keep breathing. The front door downstairs turned with new confidence and no stealth. The chain rattled in a meaningless way, a kind of music without rhythm. The door opened the measured width of Edie's palm and held there, and then widened with its usual sigh. Cold air fingered down the hallway. The smell of wet iron arrived in the nursery as if someone had carried in a bucket and set it down quietly. On the monitor screen, the angle shifted. Not a kick, not a bump, an accommodating tilt, as if the camera itself understood it should look with more attention. The wrong Edie did not look toward the door. She did not look toward the crib. She looked straight ahead, into the space over the rail as if taught. She looked like a woman handing herself over to the version of the world that had chosen her. Claire's voice came from the hall as a fragment of a question. Mark said her name in a tone she had never before heard from him, a tone that asked to be spared something and knew it would not be. They both knew enough not to enter the room in a way that would startle anyone, real or otherwise. They halted at the threshold with the kind of control that is not long sustainable. Edie kept her palm on the rail. She did not turn. If she turned, she knew her body would topple into either their arms or the empty crib. She did not deserve one, and she could not bear the other. She kept very still and let the small word that was not a word fill her mouth so she would not speak. The door downstairs finished its open and then closed itself in a slowly, thoughtful way, like a person who has changed their mind twice and does not want judgment for it. In the hand held, the blanket in the wrong crib shifted the width of a breath. Then it went still. The picture did not gloat. The figure by the rail did not move. The lamp in that other room kept its angle. The mobile stayed quiet. The tiny screen asked nothing further and offered nothing further. It felt to Edie like the world letting out a breath after holding it all along. She drew her hand back an inch to test the line. The air resisted, not with force, but with expectation. She set her palm back on the rail because expectations are laws when they live in a house that knows your name. Behind her, Claire said a single syllable that did not resolve into anything. Mark made the small apology sound you make when you drop a spoon. No one in the doorway knew where to set their eyes. No one said open your hand or lift your palm. No one told her to step away. They and she had come to understand a fact beneath facts, that the room would not accept any ordinary order yelled at it in ordinary language. The page boy officer would have nodded had she been in the doorway, because some scenes tell you the shape you must take and the shape you must not. Edie did not know how long she stood with her hand on the rail. She learned the grain under her palm in minute relief, the ridges running like quiet water. She learned the chip of paint near the screw head on the inside rail where someone had tightened something in a hurry once. She learned that if she leaned a fraction of weight into the wood, the crib made a sentence of gentle complaints. When she finally lifted her hand, nothing in the wrong room changed. When she stepped back, the width of her own foot, the figure in the screen did not follow. It remained where she had been, doing the job she had abandoned, looking at the space where weight had suggested itself under a blanket. It stood the way someone stands late in a shift in a red-lit factory, waiting for the conveyor to start again, refusing to imagine what they will be asked to lift when it does. The front door downstairs moved once more, and then accepted its old role. Edie did not hear it again. She turned at last, because bodies cannot stand forever in one pose without owing interest. Claire reached her and put her fingers lightly on Edie's forearm, as if touching a hot pipe to see how hot it is. Mark stood behind Claire with his mouth align and his eyes too alive. "What now?" Claire asked, barely a breath. Not a question for anyone to answer. Not a prayer. Edie had no word to give back. She shook her head because you cannot shrug at a mother. They did not call anyone about this new shifting, and no one would have had an answer for what to call it if they had. They went downstairs and made tea because you do that when it is the only thing left between you and the thinness of the air. Claire sat with the mug in both hands and did not drink. Mark stood and leaned on the back of a chair as if helping a tired friend. Edie placed the handheld face down on the table and then turned it face up and then turned it face down again. A day went by like that. Another did. Time lost its numbers and took up a wide, slow breath. Each morning, the porch light shut off in a practical way. Each night, it came on with the mild authority of a machine. Flyers learned to hold the water at the edges of their tape. Cars moved along the street and did their lodge noises when they cooled. Inquiries came and went down hallways and into files. People said name and then said the child's name to make themselves feel like something personal had been preserved. The town put itself to bed each dusk significantly the same as it always had, and woke again to its work as if roads and roofs and rules could keep it stitched. The wrong room kept making itself when asked. The right room sometimes admitted itself and sometimes refused. In the wrong room, the figure by the rail weathered further away day by day, as if being asked to be faithful to something was a kind of climate that wore you down. Edie saw a day when there was no figure at all, only the rail and a stripe of blank wall where a body had once been. Her heart poured at her ribs and then lay down like an animal asked to wait outside a shop. On a midnight with the sky clear and hard and distant, when the air had the thin cold of something polished too much, she woke on the couch with the sense of being watched without malice. She sat up slowly to keep the feeling from breaking. The handheld had turned to its dim, ready state, asleep with one eye open. She touched it, and the room on the screen came to standing with her. It was the wrong room again, patient and whole. At the rail, there was only the idea of a woman, 2 strokes, a suggestion, and in the crib, a small shape lifted a blanket the height and weight of a breath and let it down. Edie walked to the foyer, with her hands empty at her sides. She set her palm on the door. The wood was as it had been all its life, the paint a little chalky, the grain speaking under it, the metal cold even indoors. She did not turn the knob. She held the door as if to keep it from leaving. She stood there until her hand went numb and her mind quieted. By the time dawn scraped a little silver along the tops of the trees, the shape in the screen had settled into its creases and stayed. The figure by the rail did not return for it. The room held itself at a set of angles that would never be entirely right in any world she would live to see. Claire came down the stairs slowly and stood on the last stair and looked at Edie as if they had both stayed out late without meaning to. Edie lifted the cup of her hands the way you do when you wait for someone to give you something and do not know if they will. They did not speak the child's name aloud in those dawn minutes, not because they were afraid it would break the picture, but because they wanted to keep something for the body when it returned, even if the body did not return. You ration the sound of certain names the way you ration candles in an outage. You pick where you put the light and the warmth. Days kept arriving. They brought their small requests like poor relations, garbage out, sheets washed, a message returned with the right tone, the plants watered however much was correct. Claire and Mark learned to walk by the nursery with their faces arranged the way you arrange your face when it rains at a graveside. Edie learned to prevent her breath from catching when the front door responded to weather and the metal spoke. She learned where on the rail the paint had smoothed to an oil-soft shine from her palm and how to step around that spot so she would not disturb it. She learned to resist the little voice in herself that asked every hour if she should turn on the monitor to check. She checked anyway with a discipline that hurt. The flyers faded at the edges and were replaced, not because anyone believed paper would turn into a child, but because people do not know what to do with their hands. The casseroles stopped arriving at a pace that made the refrigerator into a puzzle. Then they came with holidays and without. Then they stopped, except for the neighbor across the street who could not keep herself from cooking for other people when she was frightened, which was often. She delivered soup in jars and smiled like a person who knows she has brought firewood to a house with no stove. The men and women with belts came with updates you could stack like stale bread. They came politely when a thing like protocol required, and went away when they had said the items that must be said into the air. A detective with a necktie that did not live in this town asked questions in a living room that had seen its share, and then froze when the handheld clicked and light touched his papers. He looked at the monitor with interest that had nothing to do with evidence. He said the word interference once, and the word feed once, and then allowed both to die because they had too much life in them. He touched his tie and made it lie down under his fingers. At some point, a company sent new monitors in a box with glossy pictures on the sides. The box looked better than the items inside. Mark cut the tape and lifted the flap with an economy that made Edie want to bless his hands. Claire read the sheet aloud without meaning to, just to put sound into the house in a way that wasn't a whisper. The units were placed where the old ones had been and plugged in, and the old ones were wrapped and put in the hall closet where things go to be honored until they can be gotten rid of without making a wound. The new screens, when turned on, showed the right room with a neat hunger, happy to prove their worth. Edie watched them be competent and felt nothing. Later that evening, she took one of the old monitors from the closet and set it on the dresser again at a little angle that matched an old memory. She pressed the button and the picture took its time and then arrived with the same wrong, patient furniture. The new units kept showing proof of what anyone could see with their eyes. The old one kept its wrong promise. Edie learned which she needed on which days. Winter cracked and flaked into something kinder. The heater took long breaks and then came back without being asked. The street developed its evenings of young mothers pushing strollers that made Claire's face change shape. Claire built a habit of lifting her eyes when they passed and then putting them down again carefully, as if to avoid dropping something fragile. Mark found reasons to be in the yard when it happened and rearranged a hose. Edie stayed inside and kept a hand on the rail when the wheels creaked on the sidewalk, because if you cannot fight the tide, you can at least keep hold of what it wets. The day came when the monitor showed a room with moons and a crib that did not shift at all, and a figure that had given itself so thoroughly to standing that it had become a piece of the room. A tall object made of nothing the camera could quite render. The day came when the front door did not turn at any hour. The house kept its sound of pipes and its cupboards full of things set in lines. The lists on the corkboard had been replaced by one list that said nothing useful, and no one had touched it since the day Claire wrote it with her mouth set. Spring mornings smelled like rain, even when the sun shone. The living room windows opened a crack for fresh air and were then shut because the world's S sounds were too alive. Someone power washed their driveway, and the noise made Edie's bones feel sanded down. School buses announced themselves like a long-ago memory. The church bell at the corner did its competent work. On a morning like that, the handheld woke itself with no reason and presented the right room without ceremony. Light fell across the crib in a flat band. The blanket had its crease traveling lengthwise the way Claire liked it. The lampshade had not been corrected. There was the noise of a car door at the curb, the quiet of someone adjusting a purse strap. The camera did not bother to shift. In the frame, Edie stood by the crib as she had all those times, hand on the rail, face turned toward the door. It was her without argument, a clean record. She was in the kitchen at that moment, lifting mugs from the dishwasher with both hands. The sight on the screen made the mugs heavier and then lighter. She set them down and went to the monitor and put a finger against the glass as if the picture were a thing you could smear and introduce a flaw into. The image held like the face of a lake under ice. Claire stepped from the hall with her mouth open in a soundless question and stopped. Mark stepped up behind her with a towel still in his hand and held it like a banner at half-mast. All three stood and looked at a woman in a room and said nothing, because nothing you can say invents a rule for a world where both of you are in it and are not. The hallway took a breath again. The porch light thought in a tiny way about coming on and decided against it. The front door bided. The screen stayed. The figure did not lift a hand or turn a head or blink. The world did not break. It did not heal either. They got used to it with that horrid skill people have. There came to be a rhythm to it. Some days the wrong room, some days the right. All days a rail to hold. People are animals, and animals learn the shape of their cage and walk it with dignity. Edie did not go back to work. There was no afterward for the old errands. She stayed in houses, theirs, her own, houses she was asked to watch when a neighbor needed to go and not think about roof leaks, and found herself in a new trade that had not existed the day before. People asked her to stay and keep the hum going. She stood under vents and listened to compressors click. She learned the voice of each refrigerator. She could tell you by the way a sump pump woke whether it would need replacing before winter. She could tell by a house's cough whether a window had been left open in a far room. She kept lists for other people who needed lists and wrote passwords for internet boxes in clear block letters and laid them near phones. She learned the small maps of each place as if teaching her feet to read. She avoided new monitors when she could. When she could not, she turned them around to face the wall and let them talk into the plaster rather than into her chest. The word wait still lived in her mouth, like a sore tooth healed over wrong. Some mornings she found she had pressed her palm to a counter and left it there a while. Sometimes, washing a cup, she would hold it with her hand against the lip, as if feeling for the old rail, and stop and make herself set the cup down. The habit lived in her the way old songs do. There were days the wrong room did not come at all, and she wondered what she missed. There were days it came quickly, when asked, bold and ready. And she looked and did not look, and then said the baby's name inside her head, the way people say the names of cities where they have been happy. The figure at the rail returned sometimes, thinned to a whisper of form, and sometimes not at all. The shape in the wrong crib rose and fell in a slow tide, or not. She learned to sit with both versions without asking which one wanted her. The house trained her, and she trained the house until both were tired and both accepted the rules. When summer put its arm around the town, the air wavered above the road in the afternoon and turned to warm glass. Neighbors took their lawn chairs to their porches and held cold drinks and spoke in their knees. People asked after one another in the good way rather than the bad way. Children went past on bikes with wild handlebars like deer horns. The flyers had finally gone to paper dust that blew away from staples. The pageboy officer came once, in plain clothes, to return a piece of nothing, and sat for a long time with Claire, and afterwards held Edie's hand, the way you hold a handle that has had a long day. She laughed at something Mark said, and cried at something the sink did, and apologized to both as if they were debt collectors. When she left, she placed her palm on the door and closed it behind her with the grace of someone finishing a job right. There is no chapter in any handbook that tells you how to be in a town that has learned your name because of something that should have undone you and did not. People did right and wrong by them the way people do right and wrong by anyone. A woman in the aisle at the store said, without malice, that she could not imagine how a person goes on. Edie said you go on, and bought dish soap, and walked into the heat and went home and set the bottle by the sink and turned the handheld face down on the counter without thinking, and then turned it back over and did not press the button. Late one night, when the air had the smell of hot dust and the cat across the street complained to a patch of darkness, Edie woke to a sound from upstairs as thin as a lid settling on a pot. She sat up and swung her feet to the floor and knew by the feel of the rug that she had slept long enough for the world to do whatever it needed to do without her. She walked the hallway in bare feet, avoiding the one board that spoke. At the nursery door, she put her hand to the jamb and let it rest there. She went in. The rail under her hand was the rail under her hand. The monitor on the floor shone its small square into the dark. The wrong room lived in it, whole and glad to be itself. The figure was not there. The crib was. In the small screen, from a camera's loving distance, a blanket lifted the exact height of a breath and set itself down again. Edie laid her other hand flat on the empty mattress and felt the heat a hand can leave. It held a warmth that could have been wood, could have been her own palm, could have been the house grieving with her in its thorough way. She kept both hands there, one on the wrong and one on the right, and allowed herself to imagine a world in which the two rooms had learned to hold the same light. Downstairs, the front door did what it had done every night of her new life. It thought about moving and chose stillness. It practiced and then remembered itself. She could picture the chain in its bracket, a neat little shape with a job. The porch boards were cool from night. The yard held its small night smells. Somewhere far down the street, a fox cut across a lawn on quiet feet. Inside, the refrigerator spoke and lay down to sleep, and the house rested its weight on its foundation with a groan a person without training might call sorrow. Edie waited. She was good at that. She had been practicing her whole life without knowing what it was for. She waited long enough to hear the heater kick once, find it too warm for work, and go back to its quiet watch. She waited until her knees complained like co-workers who had been put on a shift they had not bid on. She waited until her breath slowed and the room agreed to meet it. She waited until the screen gave the small stutter that meant it had reached the loop and found its seam and gone on. She lifted her hands. She stepped back. She left the room the way a person leaves a church when the organist is practicing, quietly and without apology. In the hall, Claire stood with her back to the wall as if to hold it up. Mark stood behind her with his hands in his pockets, like a boy too old to be told what to do. They looked at Edie in a way that asked no question and offered no answer. "We can sit," Claire said very softly. Edie nodded. They sat at the kitchen table with their hands curled around nothing. The monitors were quiet. The refrigerator hummed a good, honest hum. The window wore a line of pale morning. Edie listened to the house and to her own heart and to a very small sound that came not to her ears, but to that old newly made place underneath the ribs. It said the thing it had said before, and the thing it would go on saying for as long as it wished, with the easy gravity of a tide that has learned the shore it wants. She did as she was told. In the living room, where a small handheld rested on a sill with no picture showing, a tiny square of glass held inside it, a room with a crib and a lamp, and a certain pattern on the wall, and a rail with a place worn smoother than paint should be. The light there was the light there. The air there was the air there. Somewhere in that small square of world, a figure stood, very still, hand where a hand goes, when it is learning to be useful, face turned toward the door. Waiting. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.